Hello, hello, hello. I am not doing a whole lot. I've been busy all day long. I wanted to try and come in this afternoon. I've been trying to come in more in the afternoon because I've been coming in so much in the morning, and I wanted to try and get in the afternoon as well, as I know that there's a lot of people that it's easier for. Um, I am just getting things shared out a little bit, and then today, our focus is going to be on European ancestry, but it's going to be focusing a little bit back. This, of course, is a Gravatian behind me, and we've looked at him before, and we've talked about him before, but we're going to go just a little bit further back. Let's see which one started, because we're going to focus on kind of, a place that we've seen that humanity's really been in the entire time, like taking it back as far as, our very first tool makers. And so taking it like really deep into where we humanized, maybe is the best way to put it, like where we became we and how we became we. Um, and so I'm not really focusing on like Homo erectus and stuff. And because of that, I'm going to go ahead and utilize the European ancestry background. But we are going to take this a little bit more into, how we become a species ourselves, right? How we ourselves are becoming a species. And a part of this reasoning is because of what is happening in these spaces currently today and how it's really affecting all of us. And I see that there is so much conversation being held about this, right? There's so much interaction, there's so much problem, there's so much misinformation and misunderstanding. And I want to give a little bit of understanding of how um, that space really plays an important role in who we are as a species. How that area has been such an important part of who we are as a species for such an extremely long time. And so, with that, I thought that we would go ahead and have that kind of conversation today. So, while we are talking about well, there's so many different terms, and I never exactly know which one is correct because my brain goes back 40 years in anthropological terms. But um, the um, the area around the Nile, the area around the Levant, and what we consider the Fertile Crescent area, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. The picture, of course, behind me is early European. This is 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, early European, and we're going to step it back about 50,000 years ago and prior. So, and I'm sure we'll answer many questions on how this is early European, but if you don't already know, because you haven't been around for a hot minute, it is important to understand that as our species starts in Africa, skin adaptation doesn't come until time spent in a region for centuries upon centuries. And so, since we started in an area where it was advantageous to our species to be dark of skin and dark of eye, with hair that would help give us the ability to cool our brains, we all start out what you might consider to be Black or to be African. There are many people that look like this who are not in Africa. I mean, Indigenous Australians are actually really dark with tightly coiled hair too, and they're not African. So, well, you might associate this that way. We are all starting in a very, what you're going to associate as dark way, right? So, and nobody got rid of melanin. So we all have, we all have melanation. We all have melanation. We're all melanated. Some people have a tighter condension of melanation, and some people have less condension of melanation, right? So we all have melanation. We're all melanated. Some of us are just more melanated. So what I want to focus on today is going to be prior to 50,000 years ago and how we're moving out and how we're starting to leave this area
that has really been the birthplace and the cradle of us. First things that I want to touch on, as you know, we're getting started with the chat, things that I always try and touch on in the beginning. My name is Widda, to answer your question. I am an anthropologist, an archaeologist, a historian, a storyteller, and a healer. I am globally mixed Indigenous, and that includes to all spaces, including the one I stand on. And I am very much about, I've spent a lifetime trying to study who we are. And I've gone to school for it. I have degrees in it. I also have degrees in medicine. I am a disabled war vet, so I do not work because I'm incapable of working. And so instead, I use my time coming on TikTok and writing. But what I do on TikTok is give a base level, not college level, but a base level education of knowledge of things that many people are not accessing frequently. They're not getting, coming across a feed that they're getting, or it's not something that they're learning anywhere else. And this is because I believe that all education should be free. Nobody should have education kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall. That's fucking ridiculous. And we should not have it gate kept with language that even people with extensive degrees sometimes have to look up every other word in a sentence. So I come on TikTok to do that. The other thing I come on TikTok to do is something that I was asked by the communities that I'm members of, that I teach white people to find their own fucking ancestry so that they're not appropriating other cultures. And this is because many of the allies and accomplices within community are desperately looking for ways to find connection and find their own ancestry without appropriating from people they love. And so those are the things that I do in TikTok. Sometimes we talk about paleoanthropology that goes back further. For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about European ancestry. Again, it's that focus of trying to decolonize without appropriation. Today, I want to take it a little bit further back, and I don't really have a picture for a little bit further back that I don't know is, European or something else. And so we're going to go with the European ancestry. I can and will teach you how race has been debunked. Race is a theory created by my field and a theory debunked by my field. It is very much about the ability to commit atrocity, the justification for atrocity. It has been debunked when we realized through DNA and through the whole genome project and other things around the world that there's more genetic diversity within a primary population or an original population than there is between two primary populations. We have like 25,000 genomes genes as a species. I'm not a DNA person, unfortunately. And of those, we might share all of our genomes with somebody in Sweden when we and our next door neighbor in Kenya share completely different genomes. We can also see through things like DNA that the oldest population, the one that has all the genomes of humanity or of Homo sapien, is the Khoi population in South Africa. I go over a lot of that usually in my lives. That's just a brief touch. And I also have a real big focus. And because of that, I have a real big focus, and I don't want your racism in my chat. If you have racist behavior, you can take it somewhere the fuck else. TikTok gives everybody with 1,000 followers a live. You want to go be a racist asshat, go be a racist asshat in your own fucking life. Don't do it in mine. Same thing with phobias based on religion, gender, and desire. I don't like your God. He's a narcissist. Keep him out of my chat in every level, but that does not give you the right to be anti-Semitic or Islamophobic within my chat. Period, at all. And especially today with the things that I'm going to be talking about today. And the other things is that gender is something that we perceive within our brains about ourselves. I know me better than you know me. Don't tell me who the fuck I am. It's not your right. Sex is biologically 3, male, female, and intersex. So you keep your phobias based on gender out of my chat. And you keep your phobias based on who desires who out of my chat, because it ain't none of your business either. Ain't none of your damn business either. With all of that, I will do my best to leave comments on as long as possible. If it becomes an unsafe space because my hardworking mods are unable to keep up to all the shitheads, then we'll turn the comments off. I promise to turn them back on. I'm over on YouTube as well, and you can go over there and make comments if you need to ask questions before I turn the comments back on. But I will turn the comments back on so that people can ask questions. So again, today's live is going to be about the space in the world that's underneath a lot of conflict right now. And we're going to look at the origins of how we ourselves become a species, about how sapien becomes sapien in this area. and why this area is so important, and why it is important to acknowledge sovereignty within this area, and it's important to acknowledge Indigenous people within this area. And so that's what our focus is going to be about today. With that, let me go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Widda, if you're just stepping in, and I want to talk to you today about what we might know of today as the Levant area, Northeast Africa, and yes, East. Oh, I'm geographically challenged too, and Southwest or South North, the Arabian Peninsula area, right around there. This area, really along the Nile River, is where we start pretty much everything. Everything we are starts along the Nile. The Nile is probably more of the birthplace of humanity than any Garden of Eden ever could be. As old as Paranthropus boisei, which is, as we know now, our first toolmaker, and even before Paranthropus boisei, hominins have been living along the Nile. Now, this does not mean that we don't find our first Homo sapien elsewhere, because we absolutely find our first skeletal remains of a Homo sapien in Morocco, which isn't that far from the Nile, right? And in Ethiopia, which is actually kind of along the Nile, ain't it? And in places in South Africa, all around the same time at 300,000 years ago. But what it means is when we are coming together as a community along the Niles, where we find our earliest tool usages, we find species of human in their earliest forms of species of humans living along the Nile. It is a very fertile space in an area where fertility changes, where land fertility changes. That swath, when you look on the map today, it has a name because it's like a sea thing across. It's green on the map. That moves up and down as we glaciate, get cooling stages, and deglaciate, get warming stages, right? Because climate change happens. It's natural. It's climate destruction that we're causing, but climate change is natural. So as that moves up and down, the Nile has always been a source for us of beauty, a source for us of the foundations of really every interaction that you think of today, right? We're finding that when you're looking at the way that the Nile fertilizes the ground everywhere or every year through their flooding process, we even find that our first monocrop is along, the Nile River. So because of this long and extended period of time along the Nile River, right, we have lived as nomadic hunter-gatherer groups along this area for as long as we've been a species. Okay. Now, we know now that we come through speciation through convergence. This is 6 months old. Okay, we come through speciations through the convergence of many different species coming together and screwing with each other, because that's what we like to do. And because of that, you see a couple Homo sapiens pop up here in Morocco, a couple Homo sapiens pop over here in Ethiopia, a couple Homo sapiens pop down here in South Africa, and then converge together to become a species themselves as a singular species about 125 to 135,000 years ago. And yet we already see Homo sapiens outside of what is modern day continent of Africa by 150,000 years ago. We start to see Homo sapiens in the Levant area, side by side with Neanderthals for 100,000 years, starting at 150,000 years ago. So our first interactions with Neanderthal is along the Levant area, is along the Mediterranean basin in that, I guess it would be southeast side, right? It is in the Nile area and up into the Levant. Now, we don't have evidence that Neanderthal made it down and was living in the Nile area. But that area right around there has a lot of fluctuation and a lot of movement. So every time Homo sapiens are living up in the cave in the Levant area, side by side with Neanderthal, or down in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, side by side with Neanderthal as well, every time there is that living there, they come down, and then Neanderthals go back up, and sometimes DNA from Homo sapiens goes back up as well, right? So Neanderthal or Homo sapiens moving down into Africa are taking Neanderthal children, kids that are half Neanderthal, half Homo sapien with them home, right? And so we're seeing that there is this flux in this area. This area is as old as humanity. This area is a space that has constantly been moved through by peoples who understand this space. This is really, in so many levels, about as indigenous as you get. Like, this is staying in this space for hundreds of thousands of years, right? Even our oldest populations in other spaces across Africa only are tracing back to 120,000 years ago as a continued population. Outside of Africa, the continued mitochondrial DNA and Y DNA populations, as we trace through DNA, extend to 70,000 years ago in Australia and 54,000 years ago within Turtle Island, North America, and Abiyala, South America. So we see people who have been living in this space since before humanity solidifies as humanity, who have been living in a space where there is a constant flux and a constant move and a constant interaction with nature, a constant migratory pattern, a constant, living within and among and taking the things that are needed and only what is needed and returning, right? The tending, the interaction that we know of as our very first thought processes in hunter gathering, right? So, of course, let me go over a definition. Hunter gatherer versus collector. Hunter gatherer and collectors all live at the same time frame. A hunter gatherer group follows a migratory pattern. They might have a physical house that they have put together with either wood or muds or things like that in each single space of a season, or they may carry that physical house with them on their back, right? So people can have a summer house and a winter house and a fall house and a spring house that is completely built in different areas in hunter-gatherer communities. They just move with the season, okay? Whereas a collector community creates a home base, and each time that a season's natural givings becomes ripe, becomes flowing, they move out and they stay there for a few weeks and they gather things and bring them back to the collection, bring them back to the space, okay? So, of course, this healthy way of interacting with the land, hunter gathering and collecting, this interaction of the land that is about belonging to the biome instead of taking from the biome, it's the thing that we as a species were very much created by the biome to fulfill, because that is what speciation is. It is the biome, the whole, making something to fulfill a niche within the biome, right? That is the scientific reason that people or animals or trees speciate, to fulfill a need within the biome. And our need, our niche, the thing that we fulfill within the biome is tending. We adapt our adaptations. We're the only species on the planet that adapts its adaptations. Other species have tools. Other species adapt their space. They don't adapt those adaptations further. We do that. We're also a nurturing and communal species naturally. That's biological for us. And so with that and with that adaptive adaptation, tending is what we do. It's a very big part of who we are. So when we see hunter-gatherer and collector communities living, this is what they're doing. They're tending the biome. They're interacting with the biome. They have that intermix with the biome that creates the whole of the biome, that makes the biome healthy. Now, of course, most of us don't understand that within this early time period, through archaeology and anthropology, we've seen that humans aren't violent. This thought process that we're all supposed to be killing each other for our territory, this thought process that we're all supposed to be interacting on a method that is toxic to species growth and development, is only 10,000 years old. Now, this thought process that we have now, this experiment that failed on every single phases of experimentation, starts at 10,000 years ago within the Fertile Crescent, right? It starts in this thought process of taking what was working along the Nile, monocrop agriculture, in a space that every year is replenished by the flooding of the Nile, and moving that somewhere else. Okay. And it seems like it's going to work in certain spaces, and they decide to set up cities. Now, why are they setting up cities? Why are we adjusting from having this thought process of interacting with nature to being in one space and no longer going out and collecting, setting up cities based on monocrop agriculture? We, of course, have cities before this. We, of course, have large communities before this. This is the point where we decide to divert from being a part of the biome to stepping ourselves above the biome. When we decide that we're going to step ourselves above the biome, what we find is that there is this idea coming into play that has not been in play before. This idea is that we are not a part of the biome, we are a set above the biome. We are somehow more special, and therefore we can own the biome, a living, breathing being that we are a part of, right? So when we get to this decision that we can own the biome, right? This decision that we can own the biome then translates into owning the things of the biome, from the animals to the plants to the people. We see the start of stratification and the start of violence and the start of monocrop agriculture outside of the Nile Valley, all at the same time. Prior to 10,000 years ago, we have roughly 2,000 individuals, and of those 2,000 individuals, only 2% are things, only 2% of wounds that can be ascertained on the skeletons can be attributed to violence. And it's a can possibly be attributed to violence. We see that when I am looking at something where I see a rock has caved in the skull, I can't tell you if that rock was wielded by another hand or if that rock fell from a cave and hit somebody on the top of the head for the most part, right? Of course, there are things that you can see that you're like, oh, yeah, that's definite. We don't see those things in the fossil record prior to 10,000 years ago. Roughly 10,000 years ago, we see the things that could possibly be attributed to violence at 2% rise to things that are absolutely attributed to violence at 18 to 20%. We start to see massacres. We start to see deliberate violence. We start to see people tied up and slaughtered. So we start to see this at 10,000 years ago at the same time that we start to see the rise of stratification, the rise of monocrop agriculture, the rise of control over land and therefore control over others. We have within this something that we're doing today, something that half of the people in this chat are doing today: othering. Now, I call these our narcissistic God Kings. And the reason that I call these our narcissistic God Kings is because if you read their stories, writing, of course, comes at 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. Yet, just like with the sagas, it is the stories that are passed down through generation that get written down when writing starts to come to a community. So writing coming to these communities at 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago means that they're writing down the stories of their first kings and queens. They're writing down the stories of their histories. And oral tradition actually holds more truth to it. Like, it can be the way oral history is taught in such a way that you get more fact out of oral history than you do out of written history. Written history is usually propaganda. So when somebody's histories are told as oral traditions and as oral stories, these things being passed down, when finally put into writing, which also makes us start forgetting things, and that has been proven by psychology, when finally put into writing, are the same stories that have been passed down from generations. We see that the early kings are these God kings who are abandoned in childhood, who oftentimes, like Sargon, float down a river in a basket to be taken out by somebody who is a gardener or a tender of the fields. So somebody who is doing monocrop agriculture, and somebody who is raised in a very without childhood, a childhood where they're often harmed or abused, and a childhood without a lot of food, right? Because monocrop agriculture doesn't provide as much food as just tending the environment does. So we see that these kings are often sons and daughters of gods who have been abandoned, and it was their godparent that had them abandoned on the river. And so therefore, they themselves are some form of semi-deity. They're a demigod, right? And we see that because of that, they gather people around them and they get people to decide to give them money, to give them strength. Usually they gather a few close friends who like to be bullies. And then they go and they convince everybody to give their grain to them to protect them from the barbarians in the hills. So we see that the first time we get this othering for manipulation of masses amounts of people's brains is in our very first narcissistic god kings who are trying to get you to pay them and pay their soldiers to protect you from the barbarians in the hills who are going to come and steal your grain. Of course, sometimes it does happen that people are interacting in negative ways in this early time when we're struggling over this is mine and I own it, instead of everybody sharing the biome, right? So, of course, when people are holding things and saying that this is mine and you can't come here, you're going to have people coming down and saying, well, that was mine for eternity, so I'm going to have some of it, right? So, to protect you from the barbarians in the hills who might be coming to steal your grain, you're going to pay me to protect you with my army. And you're going to give me the grain that you don't want anybody to steal because, like it's not like you need it anyways. So, to convince you that it is not me that's taking your grain, it's somebody else, this othering that starts with the barbarians in the hills ends up down the course of society from this very first narcissistic God King complex thought process with our very first civilizations built on monocrop agriculture. And it translates down from the barbarians in the hills to that nation is going to come and steal your intelligence. It's going to come and steal your wealth when everybody is now in cities. And when everybody now around you is in cities, these things still, of course, continue. There's still the scare tactics of the people in the hills. There's still the scare tactics of that other nation is going to come and kill you when we move into othering based on an idea of gender within the ancient Greeks. The women are weaker and therefore they're out to manipulate you. The men are stronger and therefore they're out to dominate you. We get othering within community. After we get othering within community, we start to see othering based on monotheistic religion when the first monotheistic religions start. And that is where we're at today. Now, of course, the first monotheistic religion starting is actually not even in Israel. It's not even with the Heroic people because there is an Egyptian pharaoh who has the first monotheistic religion, right? Amun-Ra. So not only do we see that first religious monotheistic start of war based on a monotheistic religion and based on my religion is better than yours, starting with monotheism, then translates down into an idea of race that starts in the early 1400s, gets doubled down when Europeans end up invading Abiyala and then Turtle Island. Part of this is the fact that Europeans have long been able to state that those of Africa who are Islamic are therefore of a religion that is not their God's religion, and so they can attack them. And now we've equated race with religion. And so our first thought processes of manifest, well, not our first thought processes, but our processes of manifest destiny in the 13 and the 1400s comes from this idea that you can take it from the Islamic people within Africa. And then we get to seeing people within Turtle Island. And I cannot tell you that it's their religion because of the fact that their religion is also something Europeans are telling you at this time frame is beautiful, that their interactions with God are so pure that they are the children of God. So now I have to equate it with doubling down on that idea of skin color. Of course, this idea of skin color being something that is bad versus good comes from the biblical thought processes of the curse of Ham, who is the son of Noah, who sees Noah's nakedness and all of his children are marked. Sometimes it's also called the curse of the children of Cain. It's always a curse, right? And so we see that this thought process that people who are darker skinned are cursed by God starts during this time period and then gets doubled down until the 1850s when we see this thought process that God is not the be all and end all, the world's not 6,000 years old. And when we get to this thought process that God is not the be all end all, the world is not 6,000 years old, we start to, at the same time, filing paleoanthropology, knowing that we have been here longer than 6,000 years and knowing that God did not create us and we probably evolved because science is starting again because it's been taken away in every area that Europe and their religion that hates science has conquered. Okay. Science starting again and seeing this decides to develop the theory of race as an evolutionary standpoint so that they can justify the atrocities that they have been committing for the last several hundred years. So when we see this idea of race become a part of it, we see this idea of race becoming a part of it is very much intermixed with religion. Now, of course, I usually go on to tell you how the fact that we're using othering today with immigrants and the fact that we're using othering today as houseless people, so that, we should take a look at the fact that we're hating on our neighbor instead of looking at the people that are controlling us, who are really stealing from you and exploiting everything you are, right? Convincing you that you should trade your worth on a value you don't even set in an arbitrary system whose value is always set by something else, right? So I would normally go into that a little bit more, but I really want to take this back to what we're dealing with today in the area that all of this is starting, right? The area that this idea of ownership of land as opposed to being a part of the biome is starting, and this idea of a monotheistic religion is starting, right? As well as the space which we as a species are, it's our nursery, right? It might not be where we were born, but it's our nursery. It's where our ideas create. It's where we fulminate. It's where we're fertile, right? So, of course, if we're taking this back to the start of monocrop agriculture starting along the Nile is at 15 to 18,000 years ago. Their first evidence is of monocrop agriculture. Along the Nile, when you rip out the biome and replace it with a monocrop, it's not like there's much of a biome there to begin with because of the way it is. And then I guess there are probably a lot of the biome there. I have to take that back because I know that there are different places that are very fertile along there that have a lot of grasses, because some of those grasses are the grasses that get translated down. So ripping out space and planting them in space is not even really removing them from space. It's just putting them in a different space. But this refertilization of the soil every year ensures that even if you remove everything else from the biome that is supposed to interact with what you're planting, that is supposed to give fertility to what you're planting, that fertility is going to be replaced. Whereas in other areas around the world, the fertility is not replaced every year. After a couple of years, your land goes infertile. You can only grow monocrops in a space for, I think, depending on the crop, it's between 3 and 10 years before that spot of land becomes infertile. You have to replace the fertility. You have to replace the fertility. So to my understanding and what research I have done, Widda is the oldest etymology I can find of the word witch, and it has to do with the feminine half of the Druids. Wid meaning knowledge, and being the feminine ending. And so I use it as, so the Druids are the scientists, they're the healers, they're the teachers, they're the doctors, they're the lawyers, and occasionally they're also the priests, as in that's a certain class of Druid and a certain job within Druidry. And so I use it to denote scientists, basically. And content warning is what CW is, because I cuss frequently. And most people don't like the things I have to say because there's a lot of anti-science out there. So when we're looking at how we see this start of understanding of monocrop agriculture, it works really well along the Nile. Seeing how well it works along the Nile in a time where we're also seeing a shift in climate change, because this is, there was like a little ice age roughly 10,000 years ago. And it's not like it covers like the whole space, but it gets really cold for a while. And so in this little snap of cold, in this little ice age, we see this period of time where all of the different things that you're seeing in the world around you for your normal survival aren't as there, right? There's different things that if you had the extended period of time to adapt to, it would work, right? Yet the things that you're used to in a fertile, abundant space are kind of dying out. Still along the Nile, you're getting that yearly fertility. And because of where it is at and that the way that the line of green moves up and down, you see that it is a more temperate zone. So monocrop agriculture working there, shows an abundance, especially in a time when other places are having a lack of abundance. It's not that they're not eating, it's that they don't have as much as normal. So people are like, okay, let me try this. Um, we see this moving out into single crops around the Fertile Crescent area, up in, not up into, but across into the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula in single crops for got up until like 4,000 years ago, 5,000 or 14,000 years ago, like from 14,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago when we see the start of this. And it still happens because it doesn't all go into cities initially, right? Of course, you get one city and then another city. So we see that the monocrop becomes you're a subsistence farmer basically on your own and in the middle of nowhere, right? There might not be people talking. Sometimes there are people talking, sometimes they're not. And we've only got like 42 people in here, so it's probably not very talky today. So with that, you're seeing that people are taking this knowledge that is being learned along the Nile, that works along the Nile, and they're moving it out into the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula. And as they're taking this knowledge and moving it out there in some spaces and just a singular person, it might work for a little while, but it's still a hard scrabble life. We know that hunter-gatherer communities as well as collector communities are communities that don't work 24/7. Like hunter-gathering in our current hunter-gatherer communities, they're hard workers. They're, workaholics, work 16 hours a week. Most people on average work like 8 hours a week. And that's to provide the entire community with sustenance, right? And the work that they're doing is always as a community. It's a community minding your children. It's a community making food. It's a community making baskets. It's a community out hunting. It's a community, right? So when we are seeing the change of labor from hunter-gatherer communities, which are so much less labor, into sustenance farming communities, or not even communities, but you're over here, and maybe your entire group decided to sit, or instead of migrating, you decided to stay in one space, and so you together have created a farm and you're working that farm together, right? So even with this, we're seeing that the effort and the work that goes into actual plowing the land, removing everything from it, planting something new in it, making sure nothing kills the planting in it, making sure it gets water every day, making sure it gets weeded, making sure that everything gets taken care of, right? Is a from spring until, and sometimes even through the winter, is this long, continuous process of work where you're working from sun up to sundown on your farms. You're trying to eke a living out of a soil that, in many cases is not the where that's grain is at, right? So we're seeing that the early grains that we're seeing are all over in that space, but they're in pockets. So if you've decided that you're going to move it from this pocket of fertility over to here, and instead of it being in a biome that's interactive with everything else in the biome, you're going to remove the entire biome so they have nothing else to nurture themselves, you're going to see that it's not going to thrive here, right? So as these communities that are settled are starting, right? We see these settled communities as they're starting become very much it's just a hard life. Hunting and gathering isn't hard. Hunting and gathering is easy. And it's following the rhythm of the world around you. This is trying to force something to do something it's not meant to do, right? It's trying to store something through an extended period of time when you might not typically store things, right? So we're seeing that that hard scrabbleness leads to not having enough, right? Not having enough at any given time. So we all kind of know what happens from there, right? The idea of monocrop agriculture and civilization spreads. The idea of stratification spreads. The idea of I'm going to, convince you it's somebody else so that you will give control to me so that I can maintain control of you spreads. Because it starts in this idea of in an idea that creates a lack of, because it starts in this idea that creates a lack of, because it starts in this idea of monocrop agriculture when you don't have the ability to actually get enough, right? So you have periods of starvation, periods of lack, periods of not enough. So periods of not enough create hoarding. Periods of not enough create a need to always have enough. We see this with people who lived through the Great Depression. I don't know if you knew people growing up who had lived through the Great Depression, but I knew people who would have 3 or 4 deep freezes chock full. And I'm talking the big old chest ones that are like a room size, right? Chock full of food that they could never eat in a million years because they had lived through starvation. When people live with deprivation, they tend to hoard after that deprivation. Absolutely. And it's totally about multi-generational trauma, right? Which is why we see our first God kings too, right? Because that first God king is a child who is abandoned, right? Nothing creates MPD like abandoning your child and then having them grow up with starvation and deprivation, right? Nothing creates MPD like that. Nothing will cause a gene to switch like that, right? And so because of that, we see that there is this twist that starts within us. Species can't develop with things innate to them that are toxic to them. Anything that is toxic to a species is a mutation. Anything that is toxic to a species as a species whole is a mutation, right? Now, of course, our purpose on this planet isn't to become ants and be 8 billion, right? That's not why we were created, right? We Part of the reason that we have such long life stages is because we have the need of extended care of a single child, right? A single child in a community, it might be 5 before there's another child born in the community, right? So that there's that extended nourishment of that brain, the extended nourishment of the thought process by the community for the child, because it takes all the knowledge of all the community to spark the child, to teach the child, to encourage the child, to nurture the child, right? So we're not ever meant to get this huge, abundant thing. If we were, we would be more like ants where you have a central queen and, a bunch of babies, right? If we were, we would be more like, any other being that's main purpose is breeding. Our main purpose isn't breeding. People want to tell you that your biological drive is to procreate. And that's not the whole truth, right? Your biological drive is for continuation of species. Nothing's biological drive is for an act of pleasure. Your biological drive is for propagation of species. So your biological drive is to do what propagates your species, not what makes your species the largest fucking species on the planet, but what keeps your species whole and what keeps your species going. InWiddaOrd.com, my website, it compiles bibliographies. I don't have a whole lot of books on these particular subjects, but I have articles on all of it. And if you go to the InWiddaOrd.com, you can find articles. So I don't know if I have articles on this specific topic right here. I mean, most of what we've talked about, but I mean on the Levant area and the Nile area. And some of them are on the start of farming, but not maybe this specific thing, just so you know. But there are more information on everything I talk about on there. And it is just a me website that I just use to compile bibliographies. So yeah, it's just a .org. It doesn't matter. It's just to compile things so that you can find them because TikTok doesn't let me post them. Hi, legal. So our biological drive isn't to procreate, as in pump, pump, dump, and walk away. You have to make sure that your child lives to continue to the next generation. You cannot, as a species, only you can have sex with a turtle and have 50 eggs and walk away from that because 2 of the 50 are going to live. If it is necessity for your species to have an extended childhood and an extended brain development, and it has to be nurtured through extended brain development, which things like failure to thrive teach us as well, right? It has to be nurtured through extended development. If it must be nurtured through extended development, then it cannot be, I'm going to empty into this girl and walk away, because you need to make sure that more that child's nurtured, right? You can't just leave your seed and walk away. You have to nurture that child up. So it is not our biological drive to just have sex with somebody and walk away, right? We have to have the community to raise that child up for the next generation. Things that are healthy for a species and not toxic are how we as a species speciate, how any species speciates. You have to have things that create the ability for the species to live within the speciation. Things that are antithesis for the species livability, or things that are against a species livability, are going to be mutations that come along later. And they're going to be mutations that come along later because of an outside thing, whether it is the triggering for the MPD gene because of an extreme lack of, you know, a childhood, right? An extremely traumatic childhood that we know can trigger MPD, whether it's a triggering of that gene because of that, or a triggering of, or a creation of a gene because of that, or a creation of a gene because of a environmental factor like radiation, right? Or high altitude, right? So things that are not innate. High altitude would be a survivability thing, and that comes from Denisovan, so probably not high altitude. But um, not being able to get enough air in a space that you've always been in would be something that was triggering. So having that trigger, right, to create something within the species that mutates a gene, right? So with that mutation, we get toxic to our species as a whole. Things that we have as we naturally develop, things that we have that are healthy to our species, right, are things that we speciate with. They're what is innate to us. So when we see this switch starting to happen, when we see this switch into going from communal to exploitative, capitalistic, because even back here, this is about capital. This is about what I can get from you. Communal is about reciprocity. What do I bring to the community? What does the community bring to me? And all voices are equal, right? All voices are equal. That's what community is. That's why we've never had, well, not never, we haven't had true communism within the last 400 years, at least not on a Western sphere, right? Because it's all been based on capital and somebody being in charge. Communal doesn't have anybody in charge. The community based is multiple voices uniting, whether it's everybody votes and the most votes wins the idea of what we're doing today, or whether it's, everybody has a say, and you have elders among the community who will, kind of go, it's still not based on stratification. It's based on voices mattering, everybody mattering, right? So when we move from base on community to base on exploitation, what I can own and how I can give that ownership of value and how I can take that value from something else, right? How can I exploit the property that I have, the land that I have, the animals that I have, and eventually, of course, the human beings that I have. So when we see that this concept is leaping up, we're seeing this concept leaping up where we have other communities who are still trying to maintain their communal thought process, who are still migrating, still collectors, still interacting. Now, this continues for thousands of years. Thousands of years. We still have communities all across that area that are still like that. There are still communities to this day who follow their ancient patterns of movement, right? Now, of course, today they have maybe modernized it a little bit, right? Maybe they drive a car, Maybe they don't. Maybe they're still using the same kind of animals that they were using 1,000 years ago, right? Everything traditional was once brand new. We should adapt with the times. We should adapt with knowledge. And all science is indigenous because all science goes back to Homo erectus, right? Science is global before the fact that Christianity decides that science is evil and takes it from certain spaces. So we're having this movement still of tribes who are still interacting with nature on the yearly cycle, still trying to work within the yearly cycle. Now, I want to go over a definition here: tribe versus band. Tribe means a community based on genetic lineage. Band means a community not based on genetic lineage. Many different gene pools within a band. Mom with her 10 daughters forming their households within a tribe, right? So, based on genetic lineage, not based on genetic lineage. The people throughout this area, all of them, all of them, all of them, from the cutoff where Egypt joins, or where Africa joins the Arabian Peninsula, all the way up, really, are Semitic. That is the name of the language for the Israeli people, for the Arab people, see you Jedi, for the Arab people, for all of the languages in this area are Semitic, right? So Free Palestine is pro-Semitic 100%. The language groups that we see are becoming their own nations with many different communities within them. And they all have the same ancient language, which we see in many different spaces. And as they're all moving throughout these spaces, we see that in a few spaces, people are starting to settle down as these cities are coming into space here, and as farming is translating up. Now we see that, of course, our knowledge of everything with having to do with farming. We see the first city that we have that is based on agriculture is Angazal. It has repeated itself in the same vaguely area for the last 9,000 years. Angazal is the first city that we have based on a stratified society, and the first city that we have based on agriculture. It lasted for about 300 years in its original incantation, and then because they had caused climate destruction in a river, in the bed of a river on Jordan, basically in the valley of a river in Jordan, what is now known as Jordan, because they caused climate destruction in that area, that city faded away. It rose again a few thousand years later, and then rose again to the current it is, right? It did not rise again in the exact same space okay, because of the climate destruction it had caused. I don't think it's too far off, though, because I think that the land was able to heal. And so it's similar in space. It's just not the exact same space. So we see that this first experiment fails. And yet we see that even though this first experiment fails, this experiment spreads. First, we see it in the Fertile Crescent along Mesopotamia. This is Iraq, right? And then we see that it's really spreading across the entirety of the north of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, these nomadic groups are also having cities and nomadic groups, right? So within your nation, you might have a city that, maybe the king of your entire nation is there, right? Where you still have nomadic groups, tribes that are moving through, right? Of course, we see that, who knows with Noah, but even by Noah's account, Noah is from Jordan. Again, where we see Angazal starting, right? And Abraham is from which is Iraq, Mesopotamia. They are Ham, of course, being the rest of the world, the darker skinned world. Later on, though not then. Shem, which is the, I believe, eldest son and chosen son of Noah, to create the Judaic line. Um, and then there's a third son. Now, that third son's children, they're neither cursed nor blessed. And so they move about. Now, this is the biblical account. Um, there's no evidence of this in archaeology, of course, right? There is, of course, evidence of the fact that through cycles of global climate change, sea levels change, and this can be attributed to many ideas of flooding. There is also the fact that the Arabian Peninsula used to be connected to Africa when the sea levels were lower, so that entire region kind of floods out when the sea levels go higher at the end of the last ice age. But that's really the archaeological evidence of Noah and Shem. Abraham is a descendant of Shem. Abraham leaves Ur because he is told by God to leave Ur. He leaves Ur, and he goes to the north of Canaan, and he becomes he moves. He's moving. He becomes nomadic. Now, of course, we know what happens when the Judaic people get enslaved by the Egyptians, or at least according to the Bible. After the Judaic people get enslaved by the Christians, according to the Bible, we see, not by the Christians, by the Egyptians, according to the Bible, we see that they're moving up into a land, right? They wander in the desert for 40 years. This is the Arabian Peninsula, and then they go to the land that God has told them is theirs. This is where we get the very start of the situation that we are in now. At this point of time, there are many different nomadic groups moving through this space, and there are also major cities moving through this space. The Israelite people state to their God, we can't do this. There's people in this space. And their God says in the Bible, in the oldest writings, you can. I told you it's yours. I'll help you do it. And we see that they then go through with manifest destiny in its very first iteration and knock down the walls of Jericho, slay Goliath, right? They then go through and over generations subdue the Canaanite people as best they can. This is done through their own words in extensive atrocity. Through their own words, this is colonialism. Through their own words, this is the earliest manifestation of how the people of this God take over the entire world, how they decide that something belongs to them, and how they can kill anybody that stands in their way, man, woman, and child, which is documented extensively. So at this time, we see that the people whose land they have been moving through, migrating within a part of this space from the bottom of the Caucasus Mountains to the top of or not to the top, but to that corner of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, the people who have been nomadic through this time are still nomadic. They have cities that have been conquered. They have kings who have been killed. Their people are being harmed. They still have spaces that are members of their community where they're interacting with nature, where they are indigenous to this entire time. We see tragedy upon tragedy befall the Judaic people. Through their own documentation, we know of some of them, of course, later on that we've all documented and seen. The early ones, we see them get conquered twice and driven out. I believe it's first the Philistines and then the Romans, and then they leave, right? Of course, there are still always people within this space that are Judaic, that are from that religion and line, right? There are still people that are staying in this space. There are lines that actually trace back to Europe that are actually started in Europe, right? As they're moving across the globe as a nomadic people, as they started as a nomadic people, as they're moving across the globe, they are traumatized in every space they come across. And that should be acknowledged. Once the start of Christianity happens, right? Once Rome decides Christianity is a state religion, and they blame the Judaic people for what happened to Yeshua, to Christ, we see that the Christians anywhere and everywhere are doing everything that they can to harm the Judaic people. The Holocaust was not even the last, let's be real. It is the last state scale that we have seen. It is definitely not the first. There are several different state scale holocausts throughout the course of history of Christianity's interaction with the Judaic people. It happens in England, it happens in France, it happens in the United States, it happens across the planet. There is a constant harm for the Judaic people in any Christian nation you come across. Now, Judaism starts 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Okay. This monotheistic thought process births 3 religions, not just Judaism, but Christianity, based on the Torah, is first part of the Bible that you know about as the Old Testament, and Islam, again, based on the Torah. Islam comes after Christianity. Islam thinks of Yeshua as a prophet, but not the Messiah. Islam bases their religion on the Torah and takes it back to the thought process of removing Caesar's gold. They had respect and love. Muhammad has respect and love in the creation of Islam for the teachings of Yeshua, because both are religions that are sitting here going, this has become more about what gold you can get than it is about serving God. This is what Yeshua teaches, and then this is what Muhammad tries to teach everybody, because people who follow Yeshua have forgotten. Of course, in any monotheistic religion, there are always sects who teach things that are not what the prophet of that thought process taught, right? And so just like in Christianity, there are sects that are very horrific and sects that are not so horrific. In Islam, there are sects that are very horrific and sects that are not so horrific. Of course, based on a monotheistic God that's a war god and a warmonger and is really out to kill everybody he comes in contact with, and I'm pretty sure displays every fucking evidence of MPD. Based on that, we're looking at, thank you. This is Tom Borkland's work. Based on that, we are seeing that, so we see Judaism develop. We see Christianity develop after, Judaism has been around for a couple thousand years, at most, I believe, and then it takes over and forms a state religion around 400 Common Era. Around 600 Common Era, Islam starts becoming a religion. It doesn't become its own state, its own people until much later, like it becomes larger, it spreads, the thought process spreads. In its central, though, in its start, it is, this isn't teaching us the right thing, and we believe this, so we're going to do this, right? Both of these are based on, well, okay, so one is based on an appropriation, the other is not. Christianity is based on an appropriation. Yeshua was not trying to create a new religion, he was trying to correct his own. Islam is based on a people being forced to believe something else, not being able to even go and pray unless they believe, not being able to partake in the merchant circles, not being forced out of their livelihood unless they believed in this certain thing, right? And so Islam is a religion that very much comes out of the same reason that indigenous people across the globe today are Christian. It comes out of being forced into a thought process, and yet it takes that thought process and converts it, makes it into something else, right? So there are reasons that Muhammad teaches more words of love in the Bible than there are in the Quran than there are in the Bible, right? Because Muhammad's religion is based on being interactive and loving with each other. So the people of this area become a faith that they are forced to take by the colonization of their space and the force of them to follow a religion, and they take that religion and tweak it back to what it's supposed to be from this original thing, or what they believe it's supposed to be from this original thing. Again, this original thing colonizes this space, which then colonizes the rest of the world in one way and colonizes the rest of the world in another way. So by the time we have seen, 1,000 years ago, we start to see our first, actually, I think it's 700 is our very first crusade. We start to see this fight over this space because this space is now deemed the Holy Land. Now, why is this space deemed the Holy Land? This space is deemed the Holy Land because occupied territory was given to an entirely new group of people by their God. And he told them to kill everybody to get it. So now we have a battle over this space because we have three different faiths following the same God, three different faiths based on the book of the same God. Now, the God, of course, only chooses one of those groups. The other two groups decided they were chosen for it. It is still a space that was stolen from a people. The Palestinian people that are currently in this space are the descendants, DNA-wise, going back to they can trace Y DNAs back to not only pre Judaic colonization to the Canaanites, but back 34,000 years. Palestinians have done the research, have done the DNA, archaeologists have done the research and done the DNA to prove that the 5 oldest clans within the West Bank at Bethlehem are there for 34,000 years through their Y DNA line. After this space is colonized and colonized and colonized by first the Judaic people, and then the Philistines, and then the Romans, and then the Egyptians, we then see that people from the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula are moving up and colonizing. So we see that the Ottoman Empire takes over in roughly the 1400s. This is after about 1,000 years, no, not quite 1,000 years, 800 years of battle for this space. 800 years of battle from this space. My timelines might be off in some of these, and I do know that because I am not a biblical scholar. And so I do not know when everybody is moving through and when everybody is being colonized, or not when they're being colonized, but what groups are colonizing. And so that's why I'm trying to make sure that it is a rough time, because of the fact that, again, like, I'm not a biblical scholar, and most of this is biblical timelines until we get to the Crusades, which I know a little bit more about the Crusades than I know about the biblical first colonization of Canaan. During the Crusades, we see that there's, God, I can think of like 6 off the top of my head. I think there's more. We have a children's crusade. We have, crusades where Richard Coeur de Lion goes. We have 3 or 4 crusades by, a couple of different French kings. We have a combination of French kings and Spanish kings and English kings. We have crusades from roughly, I think 700 is the first, to, I want to say that the last crusade is like 1500, but it could be as late as 1600 or as early as late 1400, but I think it's 1500 because I think that there are early Tudor kings, not the Tudors, but the ones prior to them, the York. I believe that there's a York king that goes to be forgiven, but I can't remember on that one. So we see that it is back and forth as there are Arabic people in this area that are trying to maintain their space, and there are other people within this area that have come up and colonized, because again, this has been named the Holy Land by the Torah. Thank you. Because it's been named by the Holy Land by the Torah, and that spreads to those 3 books, there is a constant, that's my Holy Land going on. Mine, no mine, no mine, no mine. The Ottomans conquered in, I believe, the 1400. I believe that there's a crusade after the Ottomans conquer, but they maintain control. They maintain control all the way up until the late 18, early 1900s. And it's actually in during the First World War that we see the Ottoman Empire overthrown. Now we see the Ottoman Empire overthrown by the present day Palestinians. In some places, grandparents, right? The present Palestinians are members of this area of Palestine under the control of the Ottoman Empire during this time. The Ottoman Empire is controlling huge swaths of the Arabian Peninsula. Britain promises three different spaces the ability to have, or three different communities, the ability to have this space as long as they overthrow the Ottoman Empire. It promises the Judaic people their holy land if they overthrow the Ottoman Empire. It promises a Palestinian king or prince his land if he overthrows the Ottoman Empire. This is, of course, his land that is under control of the Ottoman Empire. So it is his homeland for thousands and thousands of years. And they promise the space to the French, half and half British, half French, if the French can help them overthrow the Ottoman Empire. It is the Palestinians who helped them overthrow the Ottoman Empire. And at the end of World War I, it is known to the world that the Palestinians have overthrown the Ottoman Empire, but Britain has promised the space to three people. Britain is given what they call a mandate, which basically means a guardian ad litem over the Palestinian people. And because this guardian ad litem over the Palestinian people places control of the region for them, yet places a Palestinian government and Palestinian statehood in place, they have also, and because they've also promised this space to the Judaic people as well, we see that there is an influx of people who are escaping the starts of persecutions across the European continent. Of course, there's always been persecution across the European continent for the Judaic people. During this time, that persecution has risen between the end of the First World War and the start of the Second World War, which of course then escalates in the Second World War. This persecution does not start with Hitler in the Second World War, though. This persecution is ongoing for the Judaic people across Europe. And so many people as refugees are going home to the Palestinian space to try and live within the mandate and within the accords written by the UN because the mandate is written by the UN, and then Britain takes the issue to the UN to help decide for them. With all of the accords, Palestinians are given a state. This is their land, this is their state, this is their space. The Judaic people are promised the ability to come and apply for citizenship to Palestine. The Judaic people are promised to be able to come home and live in the space that they deem their holy land. The centers of worship are promised to be kept as a no man's land, like a free state where everybody is able to go for these centers of worship. We see at the end of the World War II, we see that the refugees within the Palestinian state have, of course, increased by manyfold, right? During this time, we see this rise of an idea of, well, before the end of the Second World War, we see this rise of the idea of a Zionistic state, of the state of Israel. By 1948, we see that the UN has tried to divide the space. Their division of the space was, frankly, as somebody who's been at war, stupid. Somebody who's studied war, stupid. You don't divide a people into three different fucking spaces and put the fucking unified area in the middle of one of them and then give another people free access through all of it. It just doesn't work like that. They should have cut it top to bottom and made Jerusalem the fucking central point so everybody could access it freely. They did not. That is on the UN 150%. Like, that is totally on the UN. The Palestinians come back and say that's not going to work because they're not going to, I mean, they're going to take everything else. Like, you've made it to where they have access to all of our borders, right? We're separated in three different spaces and they have access to all of our borders. Um, and you can let them into our state because the holy space that everybody's granted free access to is directly in the middle of the largest of our spaces. So, Palestinians say that's stupid. It was. As it's going back to the drawing board, backed by the United States, Israel decides to overthrow the Palestinian government and decides to create the Free State of Israel, or the State of Israel. This is by the end of 1948. Now, as we've gone over, we are looking at people who have all been in this space for thousands and thousands of years. We're looking at a space who has been the fertile ground of humanity since before Homo sapien existed. We're looking at a space who has always been an interactive, tending environment until it became a space of monocrop agriculture and stratified society. We're looking at a space of people who are constantly in a move and in a flux with the environment until we get to a point of a stratified society. In this, what we are seeing is an indigenous group be colonized time and time and time and time and time and time again. And like happens with the US, anywhere we go, we decide to help the colonizer colonize. That's just kind of what we do as a entire fucking country founded on colonization from its very start. So at this point in 1948, we see that the Palestinian government in the places that are the state of Israel, which are kind of the thought process on the map, though I think it's actually backwards, are given, or the Palestinian people still have some control over their land. Between 1948 and 1967, we see that there is a constant battle of the Israelite government taking and taking and taking land. Weapons backed by us, money backed by us. We're helping them take this land. By 1967, the only two spaces left to the Palestinians are the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And even those are not under the control of the Palestinian people. The West Bank is under control of the Jordanian government, which it lines up against, and the Gaza Strip is under control of Egypt, along with Syria. In 1967, the Israeli government, the IDF, which is on the terrorist watch list by the UN, after decades and decades of the UN actually putting out notices that what Israel was doing and what IDF was doing was against international law, and asking for the cease and desist of Israel's activities within this area, that Israel takes Gaza and the West Bank from the Jordanians, again, the West Bank, and Egypt. It takes Gaza and Syria from Egypt. At this point of time, they are called upon by the world to give Egypt back their space. Egypt has some power in this world because Egypt themselves is the breadbasket. Like Egypt feeds humanity. So, especially at this time. So we see that they actually release Syria, but they don't release it to Egypt. They actually give it to the Syrian people, but they keep Gaza and they keep the West Bank. Of course, there are still Palestinians within Gaza and the West Bank. What they have created is this kind of, the movies that we have watched of when Nazi Germany was taking over different portions of Europe, and they would section off a section of the city and they would put all the undesirables to them in that section of the city before they decided to haul them away to concentration camps. What they create is these lines and lines and lines of barbed wire checked gates that you have to go through to get in and out and in and out. And you have to deal with guards at every step of the way and make sure that you have all of your papers, right? Especially if you're marked as being a person that is not an Israeli citizen. So Israeli citizens don't have to go through these gates. They can walk through. They get to pass through. It is only people who are not Israeli citizens who cannot. So we see that these are created as a barricade between Israel and the West Bank and Israel and Gaza Strip. We see that Gaza Strips quickly becomes this, it is a small area with a lot of people. On three sides, it is, or on two sides, it is connected to Israel. So all of these fences and these borders. Seawater is on one side, so we're not looking at fresh water from that area. And to the south is Syria. For a while, it's Egypt and then Syria. So we see, or to the south, it's Syria. We see that there is a control of the water, a control of the food, a control of the electricity, a control of all services. 3 miles out, the water is patrolled by gunships, and you can't fish more than 3 miles out or you get shot. The West Bank seems to have it in some areas a little bit easier, only in the fact that it's more space and more people. They still have all of the control taken from them. They do have a very wide, long border with Jordan, which can help to some extent and has at times, but not always. And so we see that even within the West Bank, people have to go into Israel to work. They have to go into Israel to do things. And even within the West Bank, Israel is constantly coming through and raiding homes. From 1967 until present, Israel has had control of these two regions. Israel on a regular basis goes in and kidnaps children and throws them in jail. Some of the hostages that Israel released in the last couple of days during this hostage exchange were people who have been locked up since they were children for 20 years. Their families had not seen them for 20 years, and they were 19 when they were locked up. Israel, in this exchange, has gone into the homes of the family members of the hostages that Israel is releasing and taken away the food, the feasts, the things that they are gathering for the return of their relatives, medical supplies for the return of their relatives. This is in the West Bank. Israel has imposed a tighter curfew so that people can't go to work. Israel has also imposed a food like, I can't quite understand what they're doing with it, but they have this way where they're guarding the stores. So you can only go to certain stores and they're imposing what is in those stores for people to buy who live within the West Bank. So they're kind of enforcing a food desert, I guess would be the best way to put it. This is within the West Bank. Of course, we've seen some of the things happening within Gaza. It needs to be noted that within these last few weeks, that first of all, Israel has admitted in the last 3 days that they are behind the October 7th attack, that was not Hamas, that was in fact Israel. They have admitted that they funded it. Israel has been bombing, carpet bombing, as we've all seen, Gaza. They've been targeting hospitals and they've been targeting schools. In the targeting of the hospitals, they're stating that they are Hamas spaces. When some of those hospitals, one that has been bombed regularly is actually a Doctors Without Borders space, and Doctors Without Borders has been begging for Israel to stop bombing them. They have taken infants, evacuated them from hospitals. They have arrested children as young as 2 years old, pulled them from the streets and from their parents' arms and hauled them away in Humvees with 6 or 7 people in uniforms and masks, full battle rattle. When they opened up the corridor to allow people to start moving back north during the ceasefire so that people could return to their homes and grab some of their things, they started opening fire on refugees moving north. Israel has silenced the hostages returning from Palestine. The hostages that were kept in Palestine are waving goodbye to their jailers and stating that they were taken care of beautifully, that the only times they feared for their lives was when they were being bombed by Israel. We are watching an ongoing genocide and an ongoing manifest destiny. Yes, Israel admitted in the Israeli Times newspaper, that is Israel's main newspaper, admitted to planning October 7th. It was a propaganda move, like we've seen so many times here in the United States. Probably funded by the United States. This is manifest destiny in action. This is genocide in action. I don't have answers. I don't have knowledge on it. It's not an area that I know the most about outside of the Paleolithic. I don't have ways I can fix it. I don't have ways I can fix any of the genocides that are going on. There's genocides in the Congo. The Tigrayan people are still facing a genocide. There are genocides across this planet. This is just the foundation genocide. This is just the OG of genocide. And that's all I have today is my voice. And I wanted you guys to know a little bit of the background, because I know that it's not known. It's not what they teach us in school. It's definitely not what's out in the public purview right now. Like I said, I got mine from Israeli Times. I get my news from their own fucking newspaper, right? And I had to go. And the only reason is because I have Israeli Times, because Israeli Times actually releases archaeological stuff. So I have a few things that I've gotten through Israeli Times because of archaeology. And so I see Israeli Times on my feed anyways. And because of what's going on, what I'm seeing through Israeli Times is this, right? And from the beginning, this is not okay. I don't think it's the faith. I think it's the God and the state. First of all, to be hateful to any person in that region is to be anti-Semitic, right? They're all Semitic people. So when people are telling you that you're being anti-Semitic by saying that what is wrong, point out the fact that thereby being anti-Semitic, it might be the times of Israel, Mac. It might be the times of Israel. I think Judaism, I don't like that God, period. Of the religions based on that God, Judaism doesn't want me to be a part of it. I have no problem with it on the whole, right? Yeah. So you can follow me on the YouTube. Maybe I can. Of course, I know that any talking about this actually, causes issues within here. I don't think that the people are the problem. I don't even think so. I think organized religion is a problem. I think that it's the state that's an issue, right? I think it's the state. And I think that it is always the state. It doesn't matter what state it is. It is always the state. It doesn't matter if the state is a religious run state or not. It doesn't matter. You know, it's always the state. It's always the maintaining of power. It's always the need to maintain power. It's always the need of a stratified society to maintain power. And you can see that as my life has gone on, that my numbers have slowly dwindled. And I know that the reason that my numbers are slowly dwindling is because I'm no longer on the FYP page, right? Because the conversation started talking in that area, even with the sign behind me, started talking in that area. And so it starts going down on the FYP. And just like it is for everybody else who is trying to say something and to do something. We need to move away from the idea that we have to have somebody in control of us. Oh, you smart enough. You don't need nobody in control of you. Nobody needs other people to be in control of them. Morals and values aren't a religious base. Morals and values are, I have compassion, empathy, right? Like compassion and empathy gives morals and values, gives ethics, gives the ability to take care of each other. You don't need a religious base to have compassion and empathy or to have ethics or morals. And you do not need somebody in control of you or telling you how to do it for you to have compassion and empathy and ethics and morals. We innately want to take care of each other. We do not innately want to kill each other. That is something that is trauma response. That is something that is toxic to our species. Right? Now, don't get me wrong. Do we need to call the herd? Yes, but it's not our fucking choice. She's doing it for us. The biome is doing it for us because we are overpowering the biome, right? We are overloading the biome. So the biome is doing it for us. We don't need to do it. And us killing others is not calling the herd. That's not our fucking job, right? This is not acceptable on any level. And anything that relates it to your deity makes it even less accessible. No more holy war. We don't have holy war if we don't fucking have religion. Take your narcissist. And the idea that you need a state to control you, because that's really what that is. That monotheistic thought process is based on control. It's based, even if you think that Judaism itself wasn't based on one person's need to control other people or God's need to control things, right? Even if you don't see it within the Judaic people, you can see it in the advent of Christianity, because Christianity was advented as a way to control the masses. It was a triumvirate emperor who no longer wanted to be a triumvirate. He wanted to have a mono rule. He wanted to rule on his own. And because he wanted to rule on his own, it became better to rule on his own if he had a monotheistic religion to back it up. And so he took the religion that his people have been killing for 400 years by that point of time, or the start of it before 400 years by that point of time, left out half of it and decided to form a state religion based on it so that he could control the masses. It is all about control of the masses. Any thought process that tells you that you have to fit one type, even our fucking gods are never mono until we get to monotheism. Even then, there's several different archetypes of humanity. Humanity has never been a singular. Humanity has never been a solo. It's never been a solo thought. It's never been a solo mind. It's never been a solo act, right? Even who we are has never been a solo act. It has always been, and it's always been about more than two, too. So the whole fucking Adam Eve bullshit, it takes multiples and multiples and multiples to create a species, to create who we are today. This idea that it's a solo thought process, that it's a solo thing, that it's a solo one that we should all aspire to, that we should all follow, that we should all listen to, that we should all be ruled by. For what species? For what species on this planet has that ever worked? It doesn't work for us, and it certainly doesn't work for any other species out there. It's problematic. I have thought about that, Pearl, and I think, that'd be great. I thought for a while within the US, let's just cordon off Texas and ship a bunch of people there. The problem with things like that is there's always the people indigenous to that land who don't want to, be shipped out of it, right? Man, and what do you do about that have children that are like in that? So if we just take an island Here's a country of people who have compassion and empathy. Here's a country of people who don't have compassion and empathy. You know, I always think of it as, alt-right versus moderate in the United States. As if I were to put everybody who's alt-right in Texas, now what do I do when they have children who are LGBTQ? Do I just have a trade-off with them? Like, here, every incel that we breed, we'll send to you if you sell us every LGBTQ person you breed, right? What do we do in that? Like, how do we? Because good children are born to bad people every day, right? So how do we make sure that it isn't, becoming a space of good people who are being harmed, right? And so, yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, and the thing is, though, is then we have to get into a thought process where we judge that too, right? And nobody else should be. I mean, we can judge behavior, right? Um, but some behavior can be viewed as good behavior when it's bad in the long term, and some behavior can be viewed as bad behavior when it's good in the long term, right? Take parenting techniques, right? Somebody was bitching at somebody else who was holding alive because their child was crying in the background. Their child was interacting with their older brother, and their older brother didn't want to share their sandwich. It wasn't that the child was starving, it was that the child was a 3-year-old crying in the background because they weren't getting their own fucking way because they were a 3-year-old. And people are like, go take care of your kid, you're a bad parent. And it's like, so you want her to stop what she's doing and give attention to the child that is asking for attention. You want her to reward the shitty behavior, right? So even when it comes to things like that, oftentimes what somebody is telling you is good isn't necessarily good, and what somebody is telling you is bad isn't necessarily bad, right? So how do we sit there and go, I mean, there are some things that are absolutely obviously good and bad, but there's 1,000 different things that are gray areas, right? I don't want to share my sandwiches either, especially not with my 3-year-old whining sibling as a teenager. I mean, who the hell wants to do that, right? Especially when they've already eaten and I may not have eaten, like, I mean, all I can imagine is, like, dinner was probably had by all, right? Or maybe the toddler was fed by the 14-year-old that's helping the mom because the mom's doing something. The toddler is fed, the toddler doesn't want their food, or they ate their food and they now want the 14-year-old sandwich. The 14-year-old's probably eating their dinner. Like, why would you let the nah, stop telling people. So you can't, like, even the things that we like somebody might define as good aren't necessarily good, right? That's, somebody might define it as good for them to do that, but the other, it wouldn't have been good for them to get off and go and do that because they would have been reinforcing bad behavior, right? So how do we define? On so many levels, there's such a gray scale that you can't really define. And that's where it becomes one of those things where we have to remember it has to be multiple voices. It can't just be, it has to be all combined. It can't be here does it while everybody else listens, right? It has to be all combined, especially in an age of technology. There is no reason in the United States, there's no reason across the globe that we cannot co-communicate enough to make decisions for our species as a whole, right? 8 billion people, you can't tell me that you're not going to get at least 5 billion to agree, right? So it has to be multiple. Right, it is totally easy. Well, they were using it to silence them. It was totally to try and silence the creator because the creator was another person who is speaking out against the atrocity and, was dealing with the speaking out against the atrocity, and they were totally doing it to silence, right? We have to have autonomy, right? And that shit comes with an understanding that my rights only come with my responsibilities. I only have a right if I have the responsibility that goes along with that right. If my right is the right to life, then my responsibility with that right is to ensure that everybody has that right. If my right is the right to air, then it's my responsibility to ensure that everybody has that right, right? If I have a right because I'm born, then it's my responsibility to ensure that everybody has that right because they're born. And so we have to shift the way we're looking at it. It needs to be one voice equals. It needs to be. It needs to be that, We have to have a multitude of thought. It's the only way we've ever worked. It's the only way we've ever moved forward. It's the only thing that's ever been good for us. It's the only way we've ever developed thought, knowledge. We have to have multiple in it. And we cannot allow any form of I'm poly. My partner started dating recently. It's really the first time either one of us had dated since we got together. We were poly before we got together. We knew that that day would come. We just, even now, it's still we're each other's favorite people, right? When they started dating, um, I don't want my partner to tell somebody else what he thinks I'm feeling about a subject, right? The first person he tried to date, they decided to tell me that they tried to make me believe he was telling them shit, which he wasn't. Um, Yet I still like, you're not telling this person what I'm saying, right? I don't want you to define what my thought processes are, and tell them to another person. I don't want to tell you that I think the sky is blue and then have you go to somebody else and go, she believes in science and she believes that the air moving through the light particles creates a blue sky. So she thinks the sky is blue. I mean, I do, but that doesn't mean that you understand it the way I understand it. So why would you try and describe to somebody else what I think and what I feel? I don't need representation. I am my own representation. I don't need one senator to vote for a million fucking people. What I think and what I need to have the say in. Nobody else can decide from my words whether or not that's even exactly how I think of something. Even hours of watching me on here, you probably have a good idea, right? And yet still, you don't know what I think completely, right? You might know fragments of what I think, but you don't know what I think completely. So if you take fragment A and fragment B and you reach conclusion C, that doesn't mean I'm going to reach conclusion C from fragment A and fragment B because you don't understand that I've got A plus 1 and B 3O that make me also think that F is the correct answer, right? It's not for somebody else to decide for us. And the idea that there is a singular entity or anything, right? Whether it's an entity like a god or a representative that has the ability to distinguish for me or to understand for me is really weird to me, right? Like, we know as a species that we're all individual brains, that we're not the Borg, that we don't have same think, right? We know that as a species, and yet we think that we're all supposed to be aiming for a singular idea of perfection and that we're all supposed to be allowing somebody else to speak for us, right? I just don't see that as working. And we have like all these series that state, well, we're violent as a species. But when you look at the reality of it and you dig back far enough, we see that we're not. Well, if you get more than 500 people in a space, then we reach this pinnacle where you have to have stratified society and somebody who can speak for all of them, or there's infighting. Not true. There are plenty of indigenous nations who proved completely different from that, right? We have these thought processes that we are this. But when we look at the reality and we look at the science and we look at the the knowledge of more than just Western academia, we see that we're not that. We're something completely and utterly different from that. And so we're sitting here in a time where we're watching stratified society, and I own this. This is mine. This is mine. I was given it. By fucking who? Who gave you the right to take it over everything else? And you weren't given it if there's already people there. How the heck were you given it if it was already people there? Who gave it to you? What gave it to you? What gave you that right? Right? And we're living in a time where we are able to watch mass genocides happen real time. It's not even something where we're getting information 5 days later, like the old Pony Express shit. This is genocide happening real time in front of our eyes. I can't watch half of TikTok or half of the news, right? It's genocide happening in front of our eyes real time. So when do we get to a point that we're done with allowing people to just, yeah, but we're not moving backwards far enough, right? Right? Because if we move backwards far enough, we get back to that animistic thought process, right? We get back to that not trying to kill each other thought process. We're moving it back, but not far enough back, right? When do we look at this 10,000-year-old experiment and say nobody was given the right to control me? I belong to the planet, not to you. Nobody was given me the right to control me. You are my equal. I belong to the planet, not to you. I belong to the land, not to you. I belong to the community, not to you. Right? And by community, I mean the whole fucking biome. When do we say, I belong to nothing but the biome? Nothing else has the right to even say for me, right? I'm not sure what creative society is. Is it like a thing, or do you mean creativity within society? For me, I really think that we have to get to that point, right? We have to get to the point. No, I haven't. I'll take a look at it though. I wrote it down. I'll take a look at it. Everybody's like against a global thought process, and I'm against a global leadership base, right? Absolutely. I'm against a global state, right? I'm not against a global community. I'm not against a global knowledge, right? Or a self-governing society as a global scale, right? I do not believe, now don't get me wrong, I know that because of the twists and turns of humanity, it's going to be a hot minute before we can get back there. And we'll half of us, even 3/4 of us might get to a point where we're caring and loving and taking care of each other and working at a communal base. There's still going to be all those assholes out there with NPD, or all of those people out there who have no compassion or empathy, or just all the people just too fucking tired of the shit, right? There's still going to be ways that we have to readjust for the trauma that's been committed for 10,000 years. Ways that we have to readjust thought processes, ways that we have to readjust things, because we cannot get back there without accounting for what has happened, right? We can't shift back 10,000 years and ignore the 10,000 years of trauma without taking the result of that trauma and account for it and figure out a way around it, right? But we, in my mind, have to get back to a space where we can see that this experiment is failing. For me, I really take it to land back on a global scale, really, because of the fact that I know that most Indigenous communities still follow that animistic sense. Not all, and there are, of course, people within all Indigenous communities who are very capitalistic. Yet I do believe that land back on a global scale will get us to a point where we have that communal thought process again, right? Because most animistic communities have that communal thought process. And then you get to the idea, the added benefit of the fact that we change the global climate destruction that we're dealing with, right? Because we return tending to Indigenous communities. So I do believe on a global scale, returning tending and governance to Indigenous communities. Because that was a state of coexistence that was healthy for us. And if we can return to that state of coexistence that was healthy for us, Well, and I'm not even planning anymore. My mother thought the global shift was going to happen and the coast was going to fall in the ocean. I've spent half of my life believing that apocalypses were going to happen. I'm lucky enough to have been raised in a way that you could drop me in the middle of the forest today, and if as long as I had a knife to start off with, I'd thrive. Um, because I can create anything I need. You know, I just need a blade to start, and that's only because I don't know where to find flint. Like I'm not sure where I'd find obsidian out of these mountains. Um, but I'm a firm believer that you don't need to don't prep your physical around you. Prep your mind. Know how to interact. Know what you need to do. Um, all of the things that you store in a garage won't make a difference if you have to if you have to walk out of there. All of the things you've stored in a garage won't make a difference if you have to walk out of there. Be capable of utilizing a knife to get anything you need, and prep yourself with a really good book on what indigenous plants are in an area and what indigenous animals are in an area. And you can get like one that like goes for the entirety of the United States if you're in the US. And that's something you can throw in a backpack anytime you go, right? Bug out bags are good. I'm not going to say don't do a bug out bag. That's absolutely, have something that you've got to exchange of clothes, some fresh water supplies, a knife, first aid shit, things like that, right? But having 5-gallon buckets of flour and sugar and shit like that um, is great if you have a compound in the middle of the desert. But unless you have the compound in the middle of the desert, you're very likely to have to get up and walk out. And if you are getting up and walking out, you need to be able to carry anything within that bag. So prep your mind. Know how to survive in any environment. Know how to survive in the surrounding environment and know where you're going to go, right? I live in the city. I know where I head to. And I know how to get there. And I know how to get there whether or not I can access a vehicle. And I have guns, but I don't depend on those guns. I have guns just because I hunt and stuff like that. Well, actually, I have guns mainly because my partner has guns. I have one that's my own. But I very much encourage people. Like, I mean, I could walk in. I'm the type of person who can take a knife to a gunfight. I can disarm you if you have a gun. I can't disarm you as easily if you have a knife. You cannot disarm somebody as easily with it as they're holding a knife as you can if somebody's holding a gun. And I also know that I could take a knife into a gun fight and walk away with the gun, right? So my recommendation on it is prep, but all the prep in the world won't make a difference if you don't know how to get where you need to go, and you can't do it with just your bare hands. You know? Yeah, well, and I mean, shit, I might head to Walmart and blockade Walmart. I mean, there's a few different ways. You could head down the street and blockade something for a minute and have a safe space for a minute and then get out further. To get up into the hills, you kind of need to get like even here, I'd have to cross a river to get up well, I guess I could hit the mountains here, but I would prefer to hit the Cascades, and the mountains down where I'm at aren't necessarily the Cascades unless I go east, and that's a hot minute, and then the Columbia still divides me from the main part of the Cascades. I'd rather go up north, right? Wally World's a good place to go first. Costco's another good place to go first. And Costco's probably the better one because Costco only has like one or two exits, whereas Wally World is a little bit, sometimes has a few more, right? Um, and well, because I mean, the reality is if we keep up with the way we're going, we're going to be here in a minute, anyways. We're on the edge of World War III as it is, right? But yeah, I think if I were going to supply anything like hoard big things of anything, I'd do chocolate or sugar. If I'm going to keep a 5-gallon bucket of anything, it's going to be chocolate or sugar. And the reason is chocolate or sugar will be gold. It'll be like gold, right? The other thing to hoard is tobacco or alcohol, right? Thank you. Because those are the things that are going to be gold in the end, right? Anything else you can, well, and coffee is another good one. Rice is a good one, but you can get rice. Like rice grows naturally. It's a harder process for most people in the northern, like in Turtle Island. It's going to be a harder process for most people to get chocolate or sugar. And refined sugar is an addiction. Soap is good, but you can. So sugar is a luxury, right? And soap is a luxury too, though you can find other ways, right? Yet with sugar, because of the fact that sugar is one of those, it has addictive properties, right? So most people um, crave it, like they have a necessity for it, right? So if you're the only person around with a 5 gallon bucket of sugar, you could, trade land and a horse. Antibiotics is a huge one. I mean, personally, and it's not, I mean, I have a slight med kit, but I'd probably find a really good med kit first if it was me. I'd get myself a suture kit and a really good med kit. So, and antibiotics is top of that list, and opioids. I'd find antibiotics and opioids top of that list. And I wouldn't have the opioids for trade. I'd have the opioids because of the fact that if you need to do any form of a surgery, if you have anybody who's seriously injured, you'll need those so that you can actually, like, say you have somebody, you're in an emergent situation and somebody's leg is crushed and you have to take off their leg, right? Or something like that. And you don't know a lot of what you're doing, but you have a blunt idea and you're going to do your best. You need to knock them out, right? Yeah. So for me, I'm always, I mean, I don't necessarily need sutures, though it'd always be great to have a good, like, cat's gut or something like that, right? I don't necessarily need a needle, right? I don't necessarily need the small curved needle to do sutures. I could do sutures with anything if I needed to. But having a line that isn't going to be as problematic, right? Though you can boil thread to kind of make it more antimicrobial. Uh, but opioids are one of those things that if you have something that's hugely traumatic, you're really going to need somebody to be able, even if it's just to ease their pain while they're dying, right? And then antibiotics would be a huge one. Though those are things like I would get. So you have to watch how you're getting the antibiotics because some of them have a shelf life, right? So some of them have a very short shelf life, and some of them have a more extended shelf life. So you want to make sure that you're getting something that has a more extended shelf life. And then you also want to make sure that if you're giving them out, that you check what it is and who you're giving it to, what they might have prior been allergic to, right? Because you don't want to get sulfates to somebody who's allergic to sulfates. But yeah, those are the things that I'd hoard if I was hoarding anything. Coffee is absolutely a huge one. Chocolate, sugar, tobacco, alcohol, opioids, medical supplies, antibiotics. I'd much prefer, though, that we just change the whole fucking thing, right? Like, I know how I could topple my government tomorrow. No threat. I'm not going to do it. Absolutely, without a doubt, not going to do it. I really don't want to lead. Leading is exhausting as fuck, right? I do not want to be the leader. I don't want to be president. I don't want to do any of that shit. I know how I could bring it down tomorrow if I needed to. And at the same point, um, I think that there are better ways to get there, right? Yeah. Uh, Well, and food and medicine and nature is a really good to have. Like having a book that goes over all of that stuff. You're going to find there are a lot of things that have antiviral properties and a lot of things that have antibiotic properties within nature themselves. So that if you needed a good antibiotic there, if you needed an antiviral for your lungs, you can go and get Douglas fir. If you need something that's a good antibiotic or antiviral, you can get it in nature. And there are plenty of different plants that you can use within nature that will take the effect of the opioids, right? Some areas it's going to be a little harder to find them. Some areas, you know, but and you have to be wary. Like digitalis will help, but if you give too much digitalis, you'll give somebody a heart attack. So kind of like make sure, you know. Uh, so having like a good understanding of how to interact with the herbs, to get a book that not only gives you what the herbs, if you're going to look at herbs for a medical thought process, don't just get a book that gives you the flora and fauna in your area, because that's more of a food thing. Get a book that gives you the flora and fauna and how to make tinctures and stuff, because a lot of herbal books that are for medicine will give you like, you can do this and this and this to make tinctures, and you can look at dosages like this, and it'll be in the front of the books or the back of the book so that you can refer back to it even if you have for a long period of time been doing herbal tinctures and stuff like that. It's still a good thing to have so that you have that reminder so that other people can utilize it. And then if you're the other one would be I would get you can get like my dad used to have them. They're like this, right? Tall and thin. And it was like one for the entire Pacific Northwest. And it was this thick little book, and it would tell you all the plants and all the animals in the area. Then it would tell you like the poisonous snakes and the not poisonous snakes and how to tell the difference, the animals and where you were going to find them within the area. For food and things like that, it would tell you like this plant is found here and it looks like this, show you a little picture of it, and then say this one's edible and this one's not. Water purification stuff is a good one to find. Though, as long as you have a way to boil, you're probably pretty good. And most water purification stuff, there are some like reusable fancy ones, but um, they're not. Um, if you lose the reusable fancy one, you're kind of screwed unless you're boiling. And the other ones are going to run out, like a tablet or things like that are going to run out. But it is a good thing to have if you can. If you're like if you're packing a go bag, I would have a book on medicines. I would have a suture kit. Probably, if I could get opioids, I would have, which I probably could actually. And then I would have, uh, a book on the wildlife around me, though I'm going into a place that I've grown up. So it's a little bit less of that need. I'd still have it just so that other people would have the knowledge. I'd have a change of socks and I'd have a change of underwear. I don't typically wear underclothing, but I would definitely have a change of underwear just because then you can wear your clothes for longer periods of time. And a couple changes of socks. I don't necessarily need the outside change of clothes, but I definitely need those changes of clothing. I would have a knife. Um, and then anything else that I wanted to include that, was just for having, right? Um, but those are definitely the foundations that I would have. Gloves are a good thing. If you can get like an all tool that's like a shovel kind of all tool, that's a really good thing to have. Usually they have like a sharp edge so you can hatch it with it. And then they have like a little saw blade on it so you can saw with it. Any shelter building, that's going to be helpful. I mean, you can do it with a knife, but it's much easier with something like that. Um, yeah, I mean, I probably pack my medications because I know that they'll only last for a little while, but they might last me through the worst parts. And I'd probably pack a couple spare pairs of glasses just because it'd be nice to see for a while longer. And then I'd also, as long as I'm still having room because the size of your bag matters, I would probably pack some long johns, like some underclothes that were warm. Right. Yeah. Well, okay. So the first people within Europe are going to be having come from Africa and the Levant area. And it's going to take this person behind me is from 40 to 30,000 years ago. This is a Gravatian period within Europe. It's going to take till about 5,000 years ago. So about 25,000 years after this culture has gone for people to start developing light skin in Europe. It still doesn't even become more of the population until probably 4,000 years ago, and then it's like over half of the population. Even in 1,000 years ago, still 10% of the population is dark of skin and dark of eye in Europe. Absolutely, and that's in like the northern Scandinavian regions of Europe. First people in Scandinavia at 7,000 years ago are dark of skin and light of eye. Along with a group that's dark of eye and light of skin that's coming over from the steppes. That's the Sami people today. Pretty much everywhere starts dark. By the time we all think of like the modern age, right? We're seeing that most people have adapted skin tones to the regions that they're in. So Europeans are light. Turtle Island indigenous people range in color from light to dark, depending on the equatorial part. Though they're still very copper undertoned. Asia is light to dark depending on the top part, but they kind of have a golden undertone. So you see that there's a range everywhere. So we see that Homo sapien lives in the Levant for about 100,000 years for 100,000 years from 150,000 years ago until about 50,000 years ago. And it's roughly 50,000 years ago that they start moving up into Europe and up into Asia. Australian indigenous people are like 70,000 years over there. So they're kind of that first migration out. Um, but you see that the Homo sapien and Neanderthal are living in the Levant together for roughly 100,000 years, way before them. Natufians, if I remember correctly, are after. Let me take a look, just so that there's so many different names that sometimes my names and dates all get mixed up in timelines because I don't do well with numbers very well. Yeah, so well before them. The Natufian is like 15,000 years ago. So we're talking 15,000 years before that at the end of his time. So at 50,000 years ago, the first Europeans are called the Proto-Eurasians, and they're at 50,000 years ago. And then it translates into the Gradacians, which is who he is. And then the Solutreans, which we see on the Iberian Peninsula at 27,000 years ago. The Natufians are coming in the Levant area at 15,000. So it's well after people have moved out of the people that are in other areas have moved out of that area. I wasn't warning the end of the world was coming. We were having a conversation about how we end what's going on in the Levant area, right? And in that conversation, it was people in chat were talking about being prepped, being prepared if the end of the world was coming. And so we were talking about, I personally disagree in stocking up on a whole bunch of stuff, because unless you're in a space where you're going to be able to bunker down, stocking up a whole bunch of stuff is not going to work if you have to leave with just a backpack. And that's what we were talking about is, what do you carry in your go bag? What do you have in case the world explodes? That's what we were talking about. They moved through Asia. So everybody wants to state the fact that they moved through Asia means that they're descendants from the Asians, but the Asians came there after they moved through Asia, right? So like people in Asia and in the parts that Europeans or that Turtle Island indigenous people moved through to get to where they're at now, the Asians that are there currently came afterwards, like their next migration out, right? So Turtle Island indigenous people are moving through an unoccupied space. They're not leaving family members behind who then become the Asian people that are there now. They're moving through an unoccupied space and getting here. And then more people are moving out into Asia. But it's not that they came from Asia, it's that they moved through Asia, leaving nobody behind. They didn't leave anybody behind. So they're not descended from Asians. They're not even descended from Africans, right? So the people within Africa are not the people that they didn't leave behind their mother, and their mother had more children. The people within Africa are different family lines than the people who have moved out. So it's not like they're descended from other groups, right? They're from a space. They were originally in a space, but they're not the descendants of the people that are still in that space now, right? In some cases, people weren't in that space at that time, and they came afterwards. And in some cases, you're looking at, we do know that like the original population, like the oldest population is the Quay people, but even in the fact that the Quay people is the oldest population, they're not the grandfathers. Like a person who's Quay today is not the grandfather of a person who's Turtle Island indigenous. The person who's Quay today might be, they might share a grandfather back 70,000 years ago, but they're not, it's not like, it's no more descendant from them than you're descended from your niece's child, right? Like, no, Neanderthal, we have some Neanderthal genes within us, but we are not Neanderthal. Nobody is. So Homo sapien is what everybody is. It's the main of our species. Everybody on the planet has a little bit of genome from everybody else. The most is like 6%, right? There's not a whole, it's not like even over 10%. And it's like of the whole genome, right? So we're all Homo sapien. We all have a little piece. Admixture are us, I like to say. Like we when we see something new, we fuck it. That's kind of what we do as a species. We like unusual things. It's how we came about as a species. A bunch of different species getting it on in huge orgies and creating Homo sapien children. If we see something new, we have sex with it because that's just who we are. And so we have little pieces from every species that we came in contact with, because every species that we came in contact with, we had sex with and had children with. And some of those children were able to pass on their genetics, not all of them. And because in every species that we came in contact with, we had sex with, because we like to hump like bunnies. Because of that, we see that we have little fragments. And some people only have like 1 to 2% fragments. Some people have even less than that. Some people have, like people who have 6% Denisovian and like 1 or 2. Well, probably I think the Papua New Guineans is like 0.08 or something of Neanderthal DNA. So we don't have like a major amount of DNA from anywhere else. So part of Indigenous Americans, Turtle Islanders and Aboriginals, part of them speciated here. So they have a ghost species here, which like Neanderthal species in Europe and Denisovan species in Asia. Part of them are from a species that speciates here. And then part of them are from Denisovan, and part of them are from Neanderthal. The Homo sapien part of them would have started where all Homo sapiens start, all over Africa. Mixed all over Africa, not even in a single space in Africa. But even with that, we see that their Homo sapien part of them starts in Africa, that they're picking up as they're moving through. They're picking up Neanderthal, which means that they're likely in the Levant area with Neanderthal at an early state. And then they're picking up Denisovan because they have 0.02 to 0.03% Denisovan, which means they're moving through the lower eastern part of Asia and mixing with the Denisovan there. And then they're moving through the islands of the South Pacific to Abiyala, where they pick up another species, which is the ghost species here in Abiyala and Turtle Island. And so it just depends on which part of them you're looking at, right? Again, the Homo sapiens, all Homo sapiens start in Africa, to our knowledge. I'm starting to wonder if HLD6 is an early Homo sapien in Asia, right? But I do not know. Rh negative is just one of the blood factors of the things that surround our blood. So ABO is antibodies that surrounds our blood, and they type the antibodies. When they type Rh, there's about 49 Rh antibodies that's encircled the cell of your blood. And just like the ABO antibodies encircling the cell of your blood. If you're lacking Rh capital D, which is one of those 49 antibodies, that Rh capital D, when a mother is pregnant with her second child who is Rh positive, has that Rh factor D, the first child has created antibodies against the Rh factor D. And so the second child is aborted by the body because they are attacked by the antibodies. And it is just about the fact that the mother is missing that antibody. So then her body creates it in a negative manner. Okay, I'm going to go. It's almost 6, and I'm going to be helping my partner shortly get ready for work. So, and I've been on for a couple of hours. So I'm going to go ahead and go. As always, I like to state at the end of my lives, I want everybody to understand a couple of things. The first thing is that biologically we are nurturing and communal. That is something that we need for our species. We must have community to give birth because we have mandatory midwifery, and we must nurture our children from neonate to adulthood. This means that we live in a society that tells us things that are biological necessities for our species are bad. And when you live in a society that tells you the things that you are supposed to be doing are wrong, you end up feeling depressed and anxious, and you end up feeling like you can't fit in because you're not complying to what society tells you you're supposed to do because your body tells you differently. So if you're dealing with a lot of depression and anxiety, my dog needs to go out. If you're dealing with a lot of depression and anxiety, YouTube, I'm going to go ahead and end you, but you know the rest of this since you're not there.